Hi, welcome back to my read-along of A Tale of Stars and Shadow. Today we're up to chapter 18 and I can't wait to get started. I'm going to jump right in. Okay. She's hiding something. The thief delivered those words flatly, back resting against the wooden wall of the brothel, arms firmly crossed over his chest. The Shadowhawk studied him. He'd approached Zamaril to be his informant because he'd never had any contact with any of the other men Talyn Dynan had chosen for her wing, and Zamaril had occasionally helped him in the past. Never at his request or command, and only when it suited him, but still. Like what? He eventually asked. Zamaril shrugged. She keeps going on about trust and being wingmates, but she's closed up like a steel drum holding a year's worth of gold coin. And she talks about her king shield like it's something wonderful, something amazing, which has to be absolute rubbish. Either that or she's a fool. Just because things are the way they are here doesn't mean that's the way they are everywhere else, he murmured. Zamaril spat. Since when were you a philosopher? And what does that even mean? Things are the same everywhere. Those that have money and power prey on those that don't. That's the way the world works. That's the way the world you've grown up in works, the Shadowhawk pointed out, then turned to the original topic. A shipment of Azurdia seems a steep but reasonable price for a king shield guard, and at least now we know the request for her came from here. Now he just had to work out who, and why, and whether it affected him in any way. Whatever. Zamaril was clearly bored with the conversation. She's not the only reason I asked to meet anyway. Halun told me this afternoon that 2 dockworkers he knows were arrested yesterday, on Dolgen's orders. Dolgen, the patrol captain commanding the dockwater patrol, one of the captains that regularly accepted bribes from the wing guard. What for? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Halun says nobody knows. Says both men keep their noses clean. They were yanked out of their homes without any reason. The notice is about the seed shipments. Anger rose quick and hot, hands curling into fists at his sides. Probably. Zamaril's hand whipped out to grab his arm as he went to shove past. You're too predictable, Shadowhawk. One day even that moronic bunch of feathered incompetents is going to manage to ambush you successfully. If you want to be helpful, just stick to what I asked you to do, he snarled, then pulled the darkness down over him like a shroud and disappeared into the street. The Shadowhawk stalked through Dock City. Anger simmered in his veins, adding an edge to the night around him. The Falcons had once again had their petty revenge. Arrested yesterday, a day after he'd stumbled over the dead body in the alleyway. The anger flashed white-hot, his mouth curling into a snarl. It was easier to feel that, to focus on that, than the guilt that loomed beneath it, turning his gut sour. The men weren't amongst his network of helpers. He would have already heard if that was the case. He doubted they were Senia's people either, or she'd have reached out with an urgent message. There had been no chalk marks in the usual places when he'd checked on his way to meet Zamaril. No, they'd only been arrested so that the Falcons could have a scapegoat, and it had taken him more than a day to learn of it. Too damn long. Despite the emotion churning inside him, he moved silently through the pre-dawn darkness, the hood of his usual cloak pulled well down over his face, long strides eating up the ground. He'd discovered the roof entrance to the Dockwater Patrol headquarters over a year ago, and so far, despite the 3 occasions he'd broken prisoners out in that time, neither the patrol nor the Falcons had been able to discover how he got in and out so easily. His lip curled in a brief sneer at the thought of their uselessness. Once inside, he found the watch officer inside his office. This one was as open to bribes as his captain, but he didn't care where the bribes came from, and he already knew what the Shadowhawk had come for. A greasy smile spread over the man's face as he made a curling gesture with his fingers. The Shadowhawk swallowed down his anger and tossed a small bag of coins on the desk without a word. Last cell on the left. The watch officer took the sack and tucked it into his tunic. I kept them well away from the others to make it easier for you. He didn't bother with thanks. The 2 men were asleep in their cell. Even in the dim light cast by flickering torches out in the corridor, it was obvious their faces were swollen, skin dark with bruising. The Shadowhawk's eyes slid closed as fury burned through him, white-hot, and he had to fight down the desire to go back and start throwing his fists at the patrolman guards on the front desk. They might be slack and uninterested, but this may not have been their handiwork. And even if it was, he didn't use violence. No matter how angry he was, he just couldn't. He used his key on the lock, another thing they didn't know he had, and cautiously swung open the cell door. The first prisoner woke at the sound, terror flashing over his face before he realized it wasn't a falcon or a patrolman in the cell with him. The Shadowhawk raised a finger to his masked lips, and the man nodded. Together, they tried to rouse the second man. When he finally woke, his eyes were glassy, and he had trouble standing. The first prisoner wrapped an arm around him for support as the Shadowhawk led them out through the cell door and locked it behind them. They passed nobody as he hustled them as quickly as possible towards the roof exit. Both men struggled to climb the ladder set into the wall. Guilt and shame sickened him at the sight of their struggles. These men were hurt because of him, because the Falcons had wanted to retaliate. He hated himself for it, but he couldn't stop either. He had to do something. "Stay low," he murmured once they were on the roof. "Can't afford anyone seeing us creeping around up here." The first prisoner nodded, already in a crouch. The second was barely conscious. The Shadowhawk wrapped an arm around the second man's waist, angling his body carefully so they didn't get too close, and then he and the other prisoner lifted him to his feet. Forced to move in an awkward crouch, with the weight of insensible man between them, they made painfully slow progress across a series of roofs before negotiating another ladder down to street level. Relief slackened his shoulders when they reached the darkness of the narrow alley. All around them was quiet. Dawn was still at least a full turn away. The watch officer he bribed was on shift until then, so they still had some time before the alarm was raised. He and the first prisoner propped the second man against the alley wall. The Shadowhawk reached into his cloak, tugging out the small flask he kept hidden in his tunic. Carefully, he tipped some of its contents into the first prisoner's mouth. The second man squatted nearby. He said nothing, gaze fixed on the Shadowhawk. A second later, the unconscious man coughed, spat. His eyes blinked open, still foggy, but awake. The Shadowhawk offered him another swallow of the spirits before tucking the flask away. "We've got a short walk ahead. Can you make it? I'd rather not look suspicious by having to carry you." He coughed again, blinking. "I can do it." The words were slightly slurred, but he was already clambering to his feet, leaning heavily on the wall for balance. "Thanks for getting us out." The other prisoner spoke then. "We wouldn't have been in there if not for you." "I know," the Shadowhawk said quietly. "Come on, we need to go." He led the men, the injured prisoner stumbling every few steps, through more back streets until reaching a rundown house at the end of a dank alley. He'd used it before. Those inside provided food and shelter for the homeless in the area and any others in desperate need. Its owner also knew how to contact Sania. Once the two men were well enough to move, they'd be funneled to Sania's network. The Shadowhawk didn't know where they went from there or how. All he knew was that they disappeared from the city for good. It was safer for everyone that way. He rapped sharply on the door, pressed a bag of coin into each man's hand, and left before they could say anything. His strides quickened as he moved down the alley. He didn't want thanks or any other conversation, especially blame. The less anyone saw or knew of him, the safer they'd be. Already their lives were ruined because of him. They'd have to live in hiding indefinitely, unable to return to their work or their normal lives until the Wingguard forgot about them, if ever. His hands curled in his pockets. He hated what they did so much, hated how they'd forced him into this. Thoughts busy, he took one step out into a main thoroughfare and froze. The night air prickled around him. Where a moment earlier it had been cool and sharp, now it felt heavier. He stared around him. Two fishermen walked towards the docks, chatting busily about the fog descending on the street and what it would mean for the day's catch. From the opposite end of the street, a merchant drove a cart laden with bottles of fresh milk and eggs towards him. Light shone from inside a shop on the other side of the street, a baker's if he remembered correctly. But there was something else. Slowly, carefully, he studied the pre-dawn darkness shrouding the area. His neck prickled as if something was out there. It was nothing like the breath of darkness he'd felt the other night, before finding that body, but even so. Eventually his gaze lingered on a shadowy corner in the overhang of a dark enclosed millinery. The cart passed by. Nothing moved. No sound was audible. He shook his head. He was becoming paranoid. Who would be watching him? If the Falcons or Patrol had managed to track him from the prison, they'd be descending on him already, swords drawn. Even so, he was unsettled. He walked quickly back to the apartment, taking a deliberately long and complex route and locking the door securely behind him. 2 full turns later, once dawn had broken over the horizon, he walked the streets without hood, cloak, or mask. Despite the unsettling experience earlier, he wanted to make sure the 2 prisoners had escaped cleanly and that any Falcon search didn't come close to finding the house he'd left them at. As he passed the street leading down to the start of the wall walk, on his way to the Dock City Patrol headquarters, he paused at the sight of Prince Kuan's new wing making their morning run down the wall. He'd heard talk of it, but never seen it in action. The foreigner led them, running easily, and the new guards trailed behind her, looking almost comfortable at the swift pace she was setting. The feeling of unease returned. Whatever Captain Dynan had been brought here to do, it remained a mystery. She must suspect by now that she'd been set up to fail, but she was still here and seemed set on doing her job. His fear that she would bring extra attention to him so far hadn't materialized. Even so, his gaze as he watched her remained wary. He shifted back into the shadows of a shop front as they reached the bottom of the wall and ran past, the ex-patrol captain barking orders for them to move faster. Her gaze scanned her surroundings watchfully, but she didn't seem to be overly suspicious, just the habit of an experienced warrior. Sharp sapphire eyes swept over him as he pressed against the wall of the shop, just one of the many other unremarkable humans on the street, and he took a breath, holding it, until her gaze continued past. Then they were gone, circling the block before heading back up the wall. Despite himself, his gaze lingered long after they'd vanished from sight, worried and uncertain. After a moment, he shook himself out of his daze and began moving again. His focus was the two men he'd helped the night before, making sure they stayed safe. The foreigner and her new guard had nothing to do with him. He would make sure of it. Alright, that brings us to the end of chapter 18. As always, if you don't want any spoilers, I recommend you jump out here before I start my author commentary. If you are leaving here, thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I look forward to seeing you for the next chapter soon. Otherwise, let's have a chat about this chapter. Oh, Kewin is so busted. So this doesn't eventuate yet in this chapter, but will in the next few chapters, and I'm considering speed reading through to get to that bit because I love it. But the Shadowhawk is accustomed to operating against very inept falcons and equally inept city patrol. He's had essentially free reign to undertake his criminal activities throughout Dock City for years, while facing falcons and city patrol that really don't give much of a shit in the city patrol's case of finding him in most cases, and while the falcons do care much more about finding him, they're pretty useless. But now the Shadowhawk is up against an experienced, well-trained and very good at her job Talyn, and it's taken Talyn about 2 seconds to find him simply by knowing what he does and his patterns, which is rescue these two men from the cells because they've been locked up and beaten pretty nastily, simply as retaliation because the falcons are annoyed that the Shadowhawk's notices have forced them to do something about distributing the shipment of seeds that arrived in Mithrana. So that bit at the end, towards the end of this chapter, where Kewin, or the Shadowhawk, is stopped in the street, his song magic is picking up that something's not quite right, even though he can't see, smell, taste, hear anything. And that's Talyn. She's found him, she's followed him, and that's all going to come to a head soon. But lots of fun. Can't wait for that to happen. Otherwise, this chapter was a nice, sweet, short one. Shadowhawk had a meeting with Zamaril, who's continued to be absolutely mystified by Talyn. He doesn't want to believe her. He's convinced he can't believe her. Yet everything that she's showing him in her actions and her words suggests that he can. And that's just essentially driving Zamaril a little bit nuts. And he's still trying to help the Shadowhawk where he can and where he can be bothered, even though none of the answers that he's getting are making much sense. The Shadowhawk, we also continue to get this underlying sense of almost obsessive need to help, and an equally heavy guilt that he's not able to do that properly. And that's the Dunarix part of Kewin that is driving him to look after his people, but he's completely restricted from doing that in any way other than as the Shadowhawk. And that friction inside himself is a constant war and a constant battle that he just can't escape. And that's just essentially who he is, and a result of his Dunarix heritage. So yeah, fun chapter. I'm looking forward to what's coming up soon. If you have any questions or comments about this one, as always, please leave them in the comments below. Love to answer them. Otherwise, let's soon get into the next chapter. All right, have a great day, guys.